One Step Ahead by Lundquist and Beslick.
Welcome to One Step Ahead Radio. One more session this week with a fantastic guest that we have this week, and I'm very happy to have you here, Alison. Alison will tell us a bit about her work and her book and what she's doing. I mean, some of the incredible stuff that I've came across in my professional career, but also lately when I was following the people who are really trying to make a difference. James is here with us again. James, welcome as well. Alison, welcome to One Step Ahead Radio. And Alison, please, I mean, it's a great pleasure and honor to meet you and also to have you on this radio podcast show. Please let us know a bit who you are, what you're doing. I mean, I read your book, James did it too, and please let us know who you are and what you're doing. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Alison Taylor. I am a clinical professor at NYU, which is the same thing as saying a professor of practice. I have been there since really the beginning of the pandemic. I teach sustainability and ethics classes primarily to MBA students. I'm not a career academic. I spent several decades in various sorts of consulting. I was in investigations, primarily anti-corruption. I worked in sustainability. I worked in political risk. I've worked in mainstream management consulting. And so for a long time, I've been asking complicated questions about, let's just say, it's a bit of a cliche, but the intersection of business and wider society.
And that intersection is more relevant than ever before, given the fact that we are living in I would say, rather turbulent times. James, what's your view on that? And please, I mean, you have a quite good insight in what Alison has been doing, and you read book as well. So please, I mean, what is your take on this?
Yeah, hello. And again, thanks from my side for Alison for joining us. Great to be here. And in fact, the book was actually recommended to me by one of the listeners of our podcast in one of the early sessions that we had last year. And on LinkedIn, someone sent me this thing, you must read. So it was directly based on the conversations that we were having last year, Sasha. So it's lovely to close the circle.
Yeah.
Close the circle on this. And the book Higher Ground, I mean, it was very interesting, entertaining, very readable, very approachable, I think, for people. It's a book about, for me, I mean, I work in sustainability, but it's not about sustainable business. And maybe we'll just get to that. But, you know, the title of Higher Ground, I think it's really good. And you talk a lot in the book about steps to higher ground and where companies should and can be going. Where did you get the idea for the title of the book? What does higher ground mean for you, and what should people learn from it?
I love this question. I mean, I suppose what I would say is I found it very hard to name the book. What I was trying to do when I wrote the book was somewhat reframe the conversation. And so I observed there are enormous numbers of books about how to avoid an ethics scandal. And those are about the law and policies and procedures and what happens when you get caught and whistleblowing and investigations. And they're very heavy in compliance jargon. And then there are a lot of books about how to be a green business. And those tend to be very cheerleading. They tend to emphasize and the business case, and here's how inspirational this is. And my view is these are also books that are suffused with impenetrable weird jargon. And so what I wanted to do was bring both those conversations together. I wanted to write a book that my very smart MBA students who aren't deep in this jargon could understand. And then, you know, as the more I thought about this jargon, I appreciated that it was a feature, not a bug, of this entire landscape. And so I didn't want to call the book ethics because that has a certain connotation. I didn't want to call the book something to do with sustainability or purpose or any of these other cringeworthy phrases we use these days. And I started to see that kind of part of the problem is we've got these weird, confusing metaphors. Nobody really understands what we're talking about outside these worlds. And so the metaphor of higher ground was about getting out of that kind of very confused mire and to a point we can kind of see the landscape more clearly. It's also the title of a Stevie Wonder song that came out the year I was born. So that's my and
You had the inspiration a long time ago. it's quite interesting kind of reading the book. And Sasha and I have been talking in the last few weeks about how rapidly our business context is evolving, the political context, the institutional framework, and how we sort of perhaps took for granted until very recently that there was this global consensus about stakeholder capitalism, where we're going, and the sustainable transition, and it's all kind of just sort of being blown away like week by week at the moment. Um, how's your thinking evolving at the moment? I mean, you must have written the book now kind of a year and a half ago, I guess, and it's still very relevant. Is your thinking changing about how companies should be navigating the landscape as it is evolving today?
I mean, I suppose you're right. I stopped writing the book, or I did the final edits in around October, November 2023. I think everything that I talked about in the book about how polarized this conversation has become has, if anything, accelerated. I think, if anything, I would kind of double down on my initial arguments. And to your point about stakeholder capitalism, yes, there was a high watermark in around 2019 and 2020. This seemed inevitable. We have the Business Roundtable. It was Pete, Larry Fink. The World Economic Forum was talking about this. But if you look at the language and framing of the arguments at that time, I think you can blow holes in them pretty easily. I think what we did was equate this notion of what stakeholders want with progressive political goals and sustainability goals. And what we have at the moment is what it seems to be, at least in the US, and not just the US, Germany as well would be an obvious example. I think this is Italic across Europe. Stakeholder perceptions have moved in an inconvenient direction, right? So we could call this, what I call this in class, is the what if your stakeholders are racist problem. Like we have assumed that stakeholders want social justice. We've assumed they want us to fight climate change. We've assumed that they all kind of lean in this progressive political direction. And that is a seriously amateur error. If we anchor to stakeholder perceptions, then we end up where we are today, which is this giant DEI rollback. And we have no values and nothing that isn't tied to reputation, social media exposure, and legal exposure. So I think the seeds of where we are actually were pretty clear even back in 2018, 2019, if you cared to look.
Alison, this is, I mean, just to sort of come in on this one, which I think is so interesting, because what you're basically saying is that anticipation of stakeholder progress, will for progress, was something that was constructed and created. It was never actually anchored in the reality. And in the same way, what you're also saying, which is also very interesting, is the fact that bad values, you talk about racism and all of the things that are happening right now, are actually not costing companies or people having these values. It's almost like we are living in a valueless world right now. I mean, values doesn't matter. I mean, that's sort of that's the signals that we are getting from the changing narratives right now.
It certainly is, and I think you could, make that argument with enormous amounts of support, not least what Elon Musk is up to, that values do not matter. I might, though, alternatively say that maybe one of the problems is that we disregarded and decentered values. There was an absolutely fascinating survey that came from Just Capital in December that asked the question, what do Americans want from business? Actually, number 2 was ethical leadership. Number 1 was paying a fair living wage. Right down the bottom were kind of traditional sustainability issues. So you could read that survey in a lot of ways. The way I read it is that companies used ESG as a marketing device, made a lot of not very convincing noise about DEI and net zero, at the expense of fundamentally treating employees with dignity and respect, paying a living wage, basic behavior, basic kind of do as I say, not as I do, messaging from leadership, no conversation about executive compensation. And collectively, convinced everybody that this was all a sort of shallow marketing ploy aimed at elitists. And we are where we are. Like, companies didn't get the basics right on what we might call traditional ethics, human impact, dignity, and respect for human beings. And that's what I see playing out right now. Not so much that values aren't important, but we have signaled for a long time that we're doing this for self-serving PR and not anything.
Little House of Cards. Yeah.
Yeah, but what's happening, we're seeing now, the way companies are walking back from those commitments, it seems to be that they're just bending with the wind of 2025. So what's your advice of how companies can also be credible if they need to readjust or they need to kind of connect better to what their stakeholder expectations, the real expectations are of business, without seeing like they're sort of, shifting every year or 2 years, kind of cyclical thing, saying, oh, now, the thing to do is to be, pushing these buttons. How could they kind of justify and explain to the outside world what they're trying to achieve and have that linearity?
I mean, I don't think, certainly in America, that's very simple right now. I mean, what everybody is collectively signaling, I mean, the fact that we've all collectively decided DEI was a bad idea within the past 2 weeks, that's not evidence-based. That's not grounded in your employees. That is a pure reaction to legal risk and legal retaliation. So
It's erased. It's bad. Yeah.
anyone could have signaled more clearly that what we care about is social media exposure and legal risk. And we will deploy these terms to the degree they're convenient, and then we will abandon them to the degree they weren't. If we had back 5, 6, 7 years ago been more focused and restrained and not promised to go out and save the world and said we're going to tackle these issues because they're directly business relevant. Other than that, we will let employees engage in the political process, believe what they want, talk about what they want on social media. We do not get involved here. Then I think we'd be in less trouble now. But it was difficult to do that then, and it's now difficult to go against the grain now. So, the herd behavior is pretty remarkable. I think, the way I've put this in a recent article that hasn't come out yet is I think this is the end of bring your whole self to work, if nothing else. This is the end of the myth that corporations, really wanted to think about values maybe beyond the law, that really wanted to listen to their employees, that really, were taking this purpose stuff seriously. So I think it's going to be very, very hard for most corporations to reframe this discussion. I also think it may not look as sensible as it looks right now to be behaving this way in 6 months. If we see things proceed in the US the way they look like they're going to proceed, companies are going to have to intervene to protect their employees. They are going to have to do something. They are going to have to resist some of what is going on. And so I think overreacting to what's happened in the last 3 weeks is also a huge mistake. But I'm not sure. I think it makes sense. I think companies over-index to legal and reputational risk at the expense, again, of their kind of impact on their employees and wider communities.
But also beyond, just going beyond the US a little moment, I mean, here in Europe, working with a lot of companies and talking to them, there's a lot of them who have made very long-standing commitments to sustainability, their goals, and they're wanting to stand by them, and they're very committed to that. They might modulate that, they might worry about the external pressures in the market and where it's going, but they're very engaged and they're very invested in that, and they want to stay. How do they how do you recommend they actually go forward and talk about that? Because the language, then they fall into the same language that everybody else has, saying, oh, we're going to be sustainable and investing in a better future, and we're back into the problems of the false promises of yesterday. How do you think, at the end you were talking of the book, you talk about purpose through impact. Perhaps you could explain kind of what you're trying to get at in terms of how to stay faithful and true, but also authentic and credible.
It's a really good question. I make the argument in the book that you should ground your ethical commitments on the impact that your business model has on human beings. I think that's more defensible than the law. I think it's more defensible than stakeholder capitalism jargon. And, I think it certainly doesn't solve all your challenges. Human rights frameworks have a lot of conceptual weaknesses as well, but they at least clearly conceptualize the role of business, the role of government, the role of civil society in a way that ESG and sustainability just is not credible on, as far as I'm concerned. I think that the European companies that I'm working with in general want to stick with their principles and stick with their commitments. I think they're all struggling with the need to go from unconvincing breadth to reasonable focus. They're all struggling with the perception that they've all kind of implicitly supported, which is, again, I think, a challenge with this whole stakeholder capitalism argument, which is implicitly, if any of our stakeholders care about this thing, we need to be immediately going out there and solving this thing. If anyone is yelling at us about this issue, we need to immediately address this issue. And I think how incoherent and problematic that has become is very strongly illustrated by reactions to Ukraine versus reactions to Israel. So companies, of course, pulled out of Russia. This was framed universally as an ethical imperative. Everybody, kind of stampeded out of there. Everyone supported climate change. And then we got into far more difficult issues around Israel. And in neither case really can a multinational directly impact those geopolitical discussions. So I think it's a good example of where companies have, for what seem like good, sensible reasons, got into taking on issues that they cannot meaningfully address. And so the companies that I'm working with at the moment are trying to kind of, I think, reframe that perception from stakeholders that it is the job of a multinational corporation to solve everything that every stakeholder is concerned about, and to try to be a little bit more realistic about, here's what we can impact, here's what we can change on our own, here is conversely what we cannot change on our own, and here are issues that we do not think it is appropriate, given our business model and our role in the world, to take on. I think that's a conversation everybody needs to have. I think it is a conversation that is extremely difficult to have because the responsible business conversation has made it almost impossible to say, here's what we're not going to do. Here's what we're not going to take on. Here's where we're not going to go. It's extremely maximalist.
And it's very important to separate that argument, because a lot of companies, when they talk about stakeholder engagement, they fall in the trap of thinking that's my materiality analysis. It's like a very technical, bureaucratic, sort of, and in Europe, very much constrained by the CSRD requirements of saying, oh, I've got to tickle these boxes, I've got to make sure everything's in place, rather than saying, well, what is actually the stakeholder talking to me about? Or am I asking them the right questions? Am I actually getting that input, rather than blindly asking kind of evaluation questions that don't actually answer those kind of questions?
Or if I also, I mean, just to add to what you two actually are both talking about, do we really manage the impact that is relevant for our business? That's the biggest question. And I think you are sort of, Alison is alluding to that in a way how you frame it, reasonable focus. I think that's a very good sort of a thing to think about going forward as well.
I find the term stakeholder so annoying and generic. If you're trying to map, most companies have millions of stakeholders. You're not going to put that in an Excel spreadsheet. So it's sort of strange. You just referred to CSRD. The vast majority, Google materiality assessments, the vast majority that you will see, even pre-CSRD, are basically everything is material assessments. There is, again, this huge reluctance to say, this is not a priority issue for us, because then some group that thinks it's a priority issue is going to yell at you. There's been a recent tendency to treat this more as a compliance exercise. So you can't possibly go out there and say, we're going to focus here, but not here. And that then leads to these very flattened strategies. It leads to these kind of, we've all got 3 pillars and 200-page long reports. One we're doing. Everything looks exactly the same. The average stakeholder can't even tell what's a good versus what's a bad effort. There's the same language, there's the same claims. You can't differentiate. I'm not even clear that anybody much is even reading these enormous documents.
Not many. It's produced for parts of the financial community and academics, I guess, and NGOs. Yeah.
And AI is going to read it for you anyway.
Turn this into a tick box compliance exercise, and I don't think it's fooling anyone.
Alison, we are coming close to the end of the session. This has been extremely interesting, and we could have gone on for a very long time. But before we end, I'm just thinking, James, any more comments and views from you? Alison, you're fantastic on this. I would like people to hear more about your thoughts and also the way how you frame things. It's extremely interesting. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you
just
so much
like
for having
last
me.
closing ideas, like we talk to so many confused and disoriented sustainability leaders at the moment in our work. If you had like one piece of advice for them this year of what they need to stay focused on and how they need to sort of reclaim and look at higher ground, what would it be?
I mean, I think the unfortunate truth is that the success of and or failure of a sustainability officer is all about their political and operational credibility. And so I think there is a real challenge for that profession at the moment. I think many people feel completely besieged. A lot of that relates to reporting being moved out of the domain of the sustainability function and into either the CFO or the compliance officer's remit. So there is a need to rethink and redefine what we think this profession is. I would predict that the future is going to be much more focused around relevant material issues for the corporation in question. So we will see deeper technical expertise and less of a notion that I've frankly never really been behind in the first place, that sustainability is even a coherent domain, profession, set of
Uniting concept of
whatever
all
we
these
might call it.
various
I mean,
millions.
it's kind of we're bringing us back to the beginning, which is that nobody has both breadth and depth in sustainability. You might have breadth in reporting, but you've either got deep domain expertise in a particular area, or you know about reporting. Let's just be honest about that as well, please.
No, I think we should, and I think both James and I share your view on that. And hopefully, we will be able to share this view with many other that are listening to One Step Ahead Radio. And Alison, again, many, many thanks for your time and insights. And hopefully, we will be able to come back to you maybe in a year's time and have another session to see where the progress is. Thank you very much, Alison.
Thanks
Fantastic.
so
Thank
much
you,
for having
James.
me. It was so fun to talk.
Thanks.